How did you become a photographer in the first place?
Well, as a young man, I had a dream. I had a dream about being a photographer. And as a result of that dream, I was incredibly fortunate to be...
Sorry to interrupt, but you're actually supposed to speak in the microphone. That's...
Okay.
We sometimes use those things to,
okay. Do you want to do Star Wars?
No, go ahead. I'm doing my coach job.
Okay, thank you.
So how did you become a photographer? I think a lot of people want to learn more about that. Yeah.
Well, I became a photographer by being fortunate enough to get a job as an assistant photographer to the most prestigious photo studio in London, a photographer by the name of John French, who is a cousin of the Queen, because at that time when I started, in those days, photography was a very new thing. I remember working with a photographer who was doing the first color pictures in England, which was a big deal, because in the 1960s, when I started, in the early 60s, it was still black and white. And in those days, photography was a reserve of the aristocracy, essentially. And even things like Vogue magazine were not available to the general public. The Vogue magazine was distributed to the good families. And in those days, too, when I used to work in his studio, he gave me a job, actually, when he didn't have any job. He had 13 assistants anyway. But he's just a very kind man, and he saw me, he liked my pictures. I only had pictures of my mom and dad and my brother. But anyway, I had some pictures, and he was very kind and very generous, and said, "John, listen, I don't have a job for you, but I'd like you to just be here." So I got paid. I was one of the first assistants to ever be paid, because all the others were from good families, and they were doing apprenticeships, so they call it. So in any event, I started there, and so I had a very good entree. And then meeting Jean Shrimpton, who was the ultimate model of that period. She was the first kind of supermodel, the first young model, because all the others were basically children of blue-blooded families. So she was the first kind of young, fresh girl, and she came along. I was part of a wave, really, with all of them. The two photographers that I met at John French were David Bailey and Terence Donovan. They were the kind of the foremost photographers of the 60s in London. I was with Mick Jagger, John Lennon, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones. It all came at the same time. And so I got sort of carried by a big wave, essentially, into photography. But meeting Jean, who was the most beautiful girl I ever met, especially, we were both 19 at the time. And that really carried me into it, and meeting her was like cemented my passion and my desire to be a great photographer. So I opened my first studio in West Hampstead in London at 19 years of age. And within a couple of weeks, I had a contract for DuPont to do all the others. So I've just been extremely fortunate in my whole life, actually. I seem to always be blessed with good fortune. And Florence is going to ask me another question.
You just mentioned, actually, the 60s. This was obviously a very special time. Any particular stories you'd like to share with us from that period?
Well, the 60s, I think, frankly, in my lifetime, short as it is, was the most fantastic time. I mean, it was just a revolution. We were coming out of the Second World War. All the kids were from the Second World War, pretty much. And so we had lived a kind of repressed life. I was 11 years old before I ate a banana. Television, we didn't show up until I was about 14. My dad had a car when I was just about to leave home. So, we came in with a lot of restrictions, I had to ask permission to sit at the table, permission to leave the table. So it was a very restrictive life. And suddenly, the Beatles, it was like one of the first things that came along. And they were issuing singles in those days. So they were issuing like one new song a week or a month, and it was a big deal. So it was getting like, like we get the news. It was like something new and hot. And I remember in my studio in West Hampstead, it was like we were all waiting for the next song to come from the Beatles. So that whole period was very dynamic. It was very uncharted, but it was a period where the youth took over. we'd been controlled all our lives by the, you know, I mean, it's a traditional thing. You have it a lot in France too. But, you know, we had, France is next, I think, but
yeah,
I think you get the idea.
From London, you then moved to Paris, right?
Yeah, London, I went to Paris. Actually, I was invited to go to Paris by a guy there who wanted to be my agent. So I went there, and it was also, I mean, Paris was magical to me. It was like an escape from the rain. And suddenly to see the Seine and to see the architecture is just so beautiful, and the food is so great. I mean, I came from England, you know. It's not renowned for its food. So I was just like totally, and then it was at a time, once again, where there was a lot of rebelliousness. You know, I was with this artist, you know, we used to drive up the steps of the Trocadero, and the police would come running after us, and he'd pull out his thing, which is from the president, who gave him special permission to behave like a lunatic. And it was just great. You know, it was like sunny. There were clubs like Castell's, and there was, you know, all the places that I still go back to when I go there, you know, in Saint-Germain and all the rest. So,
and there was that movie with Jean-Luc Godard you did.
Yes. Well, I didn't realize it at the time, but I was going out with a girl who was actually the assistant of Jean-Luc Godard. So I told her that I'd like to make a film, a documentary about Jean-Luc Godard. And she said, yes, well, you and about, you know, 100 other people want to make a film about him, but he never does because he hates journalists, he hates interviews, he won't do them. So I said, well, just see what you can do. So she set up an appointment for me anyway. So I went to see Jean-Luc Godard. And he said to me, so I hear you want to do a documentary about me. Yes. He said, have you seen any of my films? I said, no. He said, have you ever made any films? I said, no. He said, do you know anything about film? I said, no, but I'm a good photographer. He said, okay, you can do it. So he gave me the film to do, which was complete shocking to me. But I realized later, you know, after getting to know him and everything, that you know, he's a rebel like me. And he doesn't want to use anybody that knows anything about film. He doesn't want to use anybody that's seen his films, because they're all going to have a point of view. I'm just an innocent virgin kind of child coming out of nowhere who knows nothing about film. That's just the guy I want. So I got to do the film. In fact, then I was in his film called 1+1, or Sympathy for the Devil. I was set up as a documentary filmmaker in his film. It was with the Rolling Stones. And so I was there in some beautiful forest out south of London interviewing Anne Wizemski, who was his girlfriend at the time. And so I was talking about, you know, typical Jean-Luc thing. Actually, what he did is he just literally bought the local, you know, the current political magazine, ripped out a few pages and said, read that. So that's how I did the interview. So I was talking about sex, I was talking about poetry, I was talking about, you know. But he was a great man. We became good friends, and I went with him actually. Is it okay for me to go ahead like that?
And,
okay. So I went off with him at the time, because, you know, it's 1968 now. And I went with him and Daniel Cohen-Bendit into the Boulevard Saint-Germain, just in front of the bridges, and there's about 30,000 people behind us. And we were filming, and the CRS were right in front of us, and the pavés were coming, boom. So it was just total revolution, total wild, and it's just the kind of thing I like. So it was a wonderful, wonderful experience. Yeah. And
John,
I think
now,
I better shut up.
About your commercial career in New York, tell us very briefly about that, and especially the big turning point, because I believe that's what eventually brought you here. The big turning point in your life?
Well, that was kind of that's taking place in New York, pretty much. So after Paris, I went to New York, and then in New York, I had, once again, a very, you know, I have a good fairy godmother, I guess, and I was very nervous about going to New York, because, you know, New York is New York. It's Frank Sinatra and everything. And I didn't know how it would be received, so I kind of delayed it quite a lot. But eventually I went there. I went there with my girlfriend at the time, who became my first wife, and Eileen Ford was trying to get her because she was a beautiful girl, of course. And I went up to the office of Glamour magazine quite nervously, and I went in to see the editor-in-chief, and I went in her office, and all over her office were my pictures from Elle magazine and French Vogue and all the rest of it that I've been doing in Paris. So it was like, wow, so I've come home. And so New York became my new home. I spent 30 years in New York, and I worked 30 years with Condé Nast, with Glamour, with Vanity Fair, with all of the fashion magazines. You know, I was in a fashion world. But I was kind of like with the jet set and all this kind of stuff, you know, because being a photographer, I'm always with the most beautiful girls. I have all the supermodels around me all the time. So when you got all supermodels around you, you're living in a pot of honey. So then all the rock stars want to take you to dinner, and all the actors want to take you to dinner. Even the racing car drivers want to take me to dinner. Not because of me, but because of what I bring along.
What was your reaction to that, to commercial success? And what is the message you'd like to send people with your new career?
The message is quite simple, that, you know, I felt actually tricked by society because, you know, we're taught that to be successful and have a lot of money is the goal. Okay, so I was very successful. I made a lot of money. I had houses and cars, all kinds of beautiful things like that. But in the end, the success brought me to the edge of a kind of black hole. It brought me to a kind of a vortex of emptiness. In other words, I've got everything, but why have I got nothing? In other words, you create this wonderful exterior, but inside there's a huge gap. And it became to the fore when my mother died. I had a wonderful relationship with my mother. My mother died, and my child was born. This is November, December 1980. My mother died, and within the month my child is born, it's like the torch has been passed from my mother to my daughter. Because my mother was my inspiration, and I felt very depressed when she died, partially because there was no reason for me to carry on. I had no reason to make pictures anymore because it was all for her anyway. But fortunately, my daughter came along, so now it's all for her. But I need that motivation to do it. But anyway, I had two experiences. The first experience was in 1972 when I was staying with my agent in the 16e in Paris, a beautiful house, and I had unexpectedly, out of nowhere, a crise cardiaque, heart attack. And I went home 7 times. Home for me is where we come from. I was clinically dead 7 times. And I had an experience there, in that experience, that just totally changed my life totally. And then my mother dying on top of that a few years later led me into, I've got to find out what is going on. So I actually, back in 1973, I started transcendental meditation. I've been meditating for 40 years. I recommend it to everybody. But especially after an experience like that, where you've experienced what you would call heaven, God, and all these things that they talk about in the big books. But it's totally amazing. Fortunately, not everybody knows what it's like because you'd all jump off the bridge immediately. But it is absolutely magnificent where we come from. It's absolutely magnificent where we return to. And I do my best to reveal my passion through beauty, or through the appreciation of beauty.
And that's what you try to express through your photographs.
The reason for my continuing, well, what happened is essentially I got in the late 1990s, I kind of had enough with the jet set. I'd had enough with all the commercialism. You know, for me, the level of beauty was going down because it was all, you know, due to commercialism, everything is getting more and more mediocre all the time because, you know, if you want to get the maximum amount of people to buy your products, then you have to go to the middle of the society. And the middle of the society is McDo and Carrefour and, you know. So everything was getting so much influenced by making money that I felt that the quality of art and all the rest. So basically, I left fashion because I'm also a passionate sailor, so I left fashion to sail to Tahiti. For some reason, I bought a boat in 1984, and Tahiti just kept coming in my dreams. I have no idea why.
And here you are now. John,
you.
it's time to wrap this thing up.
Okay.
In a few words, just a few words, what's your message to the audience today?
The message is the audience is a very simple message. It's not a new message, it's an old message, but it's a message that I've been diligent to, and that is, you should follow your dream, that's all. Follow your dream. Follow your dream, whether it's difficult. In my case, it was kind of, for my family and everything, it was difficult because I was leaving all my wonderful career and leaving all my wonderful houses and things. But you have to follow your dream, no matter if you have to give up your fame, your fortune, you have to follow your dream. You have to follow your dream because it's difficult, and sometimes, you know, it's very difficult, so you have to be very courageous, you have to be very strong, and you have to be very disciplined. But I am so fortunate to have found this place and the energy that's here. I live on my boat still in the lagoon there, and there's an energy here which is absolutely magnificent. So follow your dream. Follow your dream.
Thank you very much, John.